Hi, everybody. You can find a seat. We're going to get started. Welcome to the Jewish Museum. My name is Jenna Weiss. I'm the Assistant Director of Public Programs. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this author talk by Jonathan Kaufman. The Saul and Harriet M. Rothkopf Media Program has been funded by a generous donation endowment from the Saul and Harriet M. Rothkopf Family Foundation, and we are so grateful for their continued support of the museum's programming. Tonight's talk is presented in conjunction with our current exhibition, The Sassoons, on view in our second floor galleries through August 13th. So if you didn't have a chance to visit tonight, please come back and do so. We have a few remaining related events coming up this season, including virtual courses and a virtual lecture focusing on John Singer Sargent's portraits of Jewish sitters. For full details about all of our upcoming events, please visit our website to sign up for our e-news. After the talk, copies of the book will be available for purchase at the table near the door and signing at the table near the front of the stage, so you can just line up to get your book signed. And now I would like to introduce tonight's speaker. Jonathan Kaufman is a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who has written and reported on China for 30 years for publications such as the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, and Bloomberg News. He is the author of several books, including A Hole in the Heart of the World, Being Jewish in Eastern Europe, and Broken Alliance, The Turbulent Times Between Blacks and Jews in America, winner of the National Jewish Book Award. Kaufman serves as the director of the School of Journalism at Northeastern University in Boston. Now, if you could please take a moment to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Jonathan Kaufman.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank all of you for coming out. We brought a little Shanghai weather, it turns out, with us, so for kind of making it through that. I wanted to talk a little bit initially about how I came to this topic, because the topic of Jews in China is not something that is kind of a natural book topic. A lot of this started back in 1979, the late 70s, the early 80s, when I first went to China as a very young foreign correspondent. And this is back when China was still Red China. Mao had only been dead a few years. The streets were filled with all the Chinese in their blue Mao suits and their Mao caps that we remember. There were far more bicycles than there were cars. And I was walking along the Bund, that beautiful Art Deco street in Shanghai, and I had to use the bathroom. And so I went into a hotel, and it was like walking from communist China into a movie set from the 1930s. There were beautiful marble floors, Lalique crystal windows, chandeliers, and then a bellboy who was dressed all in white with a little white cap came up to me, and I asked him in English where the restroom was, and he responded to me in French. So when I went back outside, I was just trying to imagine what was this sort of, looked like it had been dropped from the 1930s, this hotel doing in the middle of Shanghai. And someone told me that it had been built by Victor Sassoon, a Jewish playboy millionaire who was once one of the richest men in Shanghai and had built this grand hotel, which was the grandest hotel in all of Asia in the 1920s and the 1930s. So as a journalist, when you're kind of running around covering stories, you sort of file these things away. A couple of years later, I was back in Shanghai, and at that point, we were being assigned minders, kind of people from the Chinese Foreign Ministry who accompanied reporters to make sure we didn't, report on things they didn't want us to report on. And much of our time was spent kind of going through side doors and trying to escape them. But this fellow was very earnest, and he suggested I go visit the Children's Palace, which was where Chinese families in Shanghai would bring their kids on weekends for ballet lessons, music lessons, that kind of thing. So I thought, sure, that would be a nice story to do. And I went there, and sure enough, that you could see the kids walking in. But the Children's Palace looked like it belonged in Downton Abbey. It was this huge British mansion on beautifully manicured lawns, again, in the middle of kind of bustling and very Chinese and very communist China. And I went inside and I saw the kids kind of taking their lessons, but this had clearly been a mansion where a very wealthy family had once lived. There was a huge ballroom, sweeping staircases going up to the second floor with beautiful bedrooms. And as I was leaving, I noticed a small plaque near the entryway, which said this had once been the home of the Kadoorie family. And I knew the name Kadoorie, and I knew about the Kadoories because I was living in Hong Kong, and the Kadoories were known as one of the most powerful Western families in Hong Kong, one of the wealthiest families in Hong Kong. They too were Jewish, but I hadn't known that they had this history in Shanghai. Many years after that, I was assigned to be the bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal in China, and I went over with my wife and our 3 small children. And we were based in Beijing, where actually today would be considered a good weather day. We all loved visiting Shanghai. It was just a very cosmopolitan, exciting place. And one weekend, we were exploring a poor neighborhood of Shanghai. And I noticed as we were walking along, on the tenement buildings, there were shadows of mezuzahs. Not the mezuzahs themselves, but the shadow of them in the nail holes where they had once been put up. And again, I found myself thinking, what were these mezuzahs doing in the middle of Shanghai? And of course, it turned out that these were put up by some of the 17,000 Jewish refugees who had found safety in Shanghai during World War II. So kind of these encounters began to come together, and I decided I really wanted to find out what was the history here, what had brought these Jews to China, to Shanghai, and what was their story. And the story took me initially to the Middle East, to Baghdad. I think many of us know the story of Fiddler on the Roof, which is the story of many of us, certainly of my family, of Jews who were living in shtetls, ghettos, in Russia, in Germany, throughout Europe, and they either come to the US or within Europe, they begin to rise up and become very successful in just about every field. But the story of the Baghdad Jews was different. These were Jews we actually first read about in the Bible. That famous psalm where it says, "By the rivers of Babylon we wept when we remembered Zion." Babylon is Baghdad. And after the destruction of the temple, Nebuchadnezzar kidnapped the Jewish population of Jerusalem and brought them to Baghdad, to Babylon. Now, while the Jews may have been weeping by the river on Shabbat, the other 6 days they were actually doing extremely well. They were the first diaspora community. They set up synagogues. They set up places of learning. They created a Talmud known as the Babylonian Talmud. And they were very successful in business and in trade. So successful, in fact, that the various rulers of Baghdad, whether they were the Turks or the Persians, whoever was kind of in charge, would turn to the Jews for advice and would actually name one family to be the kind of advisor to the king, kind of like the secretary of the treasury, and honor that family. So this family was the Sassoons. That's where the kind of prominence they had. So that when the head of the Sassoon family was summoned to meet with the Pasha, he was carried through the streets of Baghdad in a sedan chair. And everyone, Jewish or Gentile, would tip their head in respect as the sedan chair passed by. Now, as often happens in Jewish history, politics at a certain point turned against the Jews of Baghdad, and the rulers began kidnapping Jews and demanding ransom from their families. And so David Sassoon, who's really the start of my book and of the exhibition here, is 37 years old, and he's about to take over this incredibly wealthy and far-flung business enterprise that his family is in charge of. But he's kidnapped, he's put in jail. His father rushes down to the jail, bails him out, essentially, but takes him down to the waterfront where he puts him on a small boat that he had bought to send him away from Baghdad, because his father understood that this was not going to be a safe place for any Jews, including the Sassoons. And so at 37, David Sassoon, on the verge of taking over the family enterprise, is forced to leave Baghdad, leave his family behind. He spends his first night sleeping on the floor of a warehouse in Iran on his way to India, with a gun by his side, shooting at rats as they skitter by on the floor. And I think in many ways, the story of what happens next is, it's not Fiddler on the Roof, it's almost a Shakespearean story of a man, a young man, who is dispossessed, has his almost royal position ripped away from him, and spends much of the next time, and his family spends the next 100 years trying to get back to that position of influence. David Sassoon makes his way to India, and he arrives just as the British are arriving in India and turning India into a colony. And David Sassoon, when he left, his father put a cloak around him, and in the cloak were sewn pearls and other precious gems to give him a start in his new business. And even though he was far from Baghdad, he still had all the knowledge that his family had imparted to him. He still had the connections the Sassoons had all across the Middle East and the Near East. And he begins to get into business. He's very successful in India. He's able to bring the rest of his family over. And very quickly, he becomes a millionaire in India. And one of the things he begins to sort of trade in is opium. And I'll be talking a lot about opium a little bit later. And one of the things we have to understand is that at this point, the British Empire is expanding for business. They don't so much want to, especially when they're looking at a place like China, they really want to find a place where British trade can do well. David Sassoon comes to believe that the British are the future. And even though he himself doesn't speak English, when he brings his family over, he makes all 8 of his sons learn English. He gets them a tutor in British history. When Queen Victoria ascends to the throne, he makes them all stand at the waterfront and sing God Save the Queen to show his loyalty to the British crown. The British companies at that point are very much trying to open up China. China has completely closed itself to Western trade. And the main reason is because of the opium trade. Opium is highly addictive. And at this point in the 1830s, 1840s, about 12% of Chinese citizens are addicted to opium. Now, to give you some sense of comparison, about 2% of Americans these days are addicted to either the opioid drugs or to heroin. And we know the kind of disruption and tragedy that's enveloped so many lives because of opioids. China's position was 6 times worse. And the Chinese government felt that there was no way they could respond to the West, could modernize with the opium trade existing. So they banned the sale of opium, and the British companies that were involved in it lobbied the British government and essentially persuaded the British government to wage war against China, the Opium Wars in the 1840s, designed to open up China to trade. And they succeed. After the first Opium War, the Chinese are forced to turn Hong Kong over to the British. Many of the coastal towns, Beijing, Shanghai, not Beijing, Shanghai and others, are opened up to trade. So at this point, instead of smuggling opium into China, it's a normal trade. Anyone can go there and sell it. And David Sassoon, in a brilliant business move, sees a huge opportunity. And there are 2 things he realizes that he can do. The opium is grown in India, and the British companies, Jardine Matheson and others, are using sailing ships to sail from India to the China coast, where they then sell the opium. David Sassoon realizes that if he buys steamships, this new technology of steamships, the Sassoons can get there a lot faster and can beat their British rivals in selling the opium to the Chinese. He also invests in the telegraph, which is a new technology, and he takes his 8 sons and deploys them across China. And they're able to communicate with each other using the telegraph, along with their father back in Bombay, and can hold back shipments when the price of opium is low, or they can move faster when the price of opium is high. And within a matter of 30 or 40 years, they've essentially taken over the opium trade. And it's interesting, I was able to look at some of the documents that Jardine Matheson, their big British rival, their papers are in England. And you can see the memos going back and forth between the Jardine executives saying, who are these dirty Jews, these people from Baghdad who are driving us out of business? And so by the 1870s, the Sassoons essentially control the opium trade. And many years later, when the Chinese communists take over Shanghai in 1949, they seize the Sassoon business records. And I was able to see them. And the Chinese conclude, and I think they're right, that the Sassoon family made about $1 billion in the opium trade. And that became the foundation for the buildings they were able to build, the factories. It eventually made them probably the 6th richest family in the world. Now, this is a kind of a moral issue that I think especially Jews need to think about. When I talk to the Sassoons about this and about the opium trade, their response is basically, it was like cigarettes or alcohol. It was a vice. Opium was legal, which is true. The British were taxing it. The Sassoons were, in fact, giving members of the British aristocracy a chance to buy opium stock and then profit when it was sold in China. And their feeling is we were fulfilling a need. It was a business decision. And, you know, the same way cigarette companies and alcohol companies have talked about their trade. But the fact is, the Sassoons knew how dangerous opium was. They never used it themselves. And their business records are filled with references to Chinese employees who had become useless because they were addicted to opium. There were many campaigns that were launched to try to stop the opium trade. And the Sassoons, as the exhibit shows so brilliantly, were incredibly influential in England. They were friends of the Prince of Wales. They were very influential in Parliament, and they fought tooth and nail to stop any effort to control or ban the opium trade. And it wasn't until 1912, 1913 that it was finally banned. And so I think in that sense, I think it's Balzac has a famous line where he says, behind every great fortune is a great crime. And in this case, the crime was opium. I want to talk a little bit about the women in this story because especially when you're looking at history, especially economic or business history, the roles of women are kind of disappear. And there are two women I want to talk about. First is Flora Sassoon. Flora Sassoon married the youngest Sassoon boys. I mentioned there were these eight sons. And he was kind of running things in India and China at a time when all his brothers had moved to London. Their father had felt that after being in China and learning the business, they should all move to London, and he instructed them to buy mansions, to send their children to Eton and to Cambridge and to Oxford, and to try to become part of the British aristocracy. And they were immensely successful. They did become very friendly with the Prince of Wales. They helped to fund his gambling habit, Queen Victoria's son. They had these grand parties. And it was interesting when they would write home to their father and they would write and say, oh, we had the most wonderful party. And the Prince of Wales stayed till 3 a.m. And they were so proud of themselves. I would then go to look at what the people who attended the party had written in their diaries. And it was, I can't believe these Jews are here. I would never rent out my home to them. Even Churchill, who was a great friend of the Sassoons, when the Prince of Wales became king, he wrote to a friend, I wonder if the prince is going to bring his Jews to Buckingham Palace. So there was a kind of social anti-Semitism that existed side by side with the Sassoons' ascent in Great Britain. But what it meant was that while the seven brothers were living it up and building their influence in the UK, there was only one brother watching the business over in India and China. And he died unexpectedly and very young of a heart attack. And this was a crisis for the family, like who was going to sort of run all this? So Flora Sassoon, his wife, stepped forward and said that she would run the company until their son, who was a teenager, came of age and could take over. And her brothers-in-law in London thought, that was fine. She was just a woman. They would be able to control her until the male kind of line reasserted itself. But they really underestimated Flora. She was a brilliant woman. She spoke 4 or 5 languages. She had been tutored and had a very good educational background. And it turned out she was a brilliant businesswoman. Now, she took over, this is in the late 1800s, at a time when not only were women couldn't vote or have any rights, in India they lived behind what was called purdah, which meant that they could not even be seen in public. And so Flora Sassoon begins running this business empire from her living room. But gradually, and somewhat scandalously, she begins to go to the Sassoon offices, go to the Sassoon factories, learning about the business and directing it. And in a time much like what we've just emerged from, a plague breaks out in Bombay. And it's the bubonic plague. And the workers who work for the Sassoons in their factories and so forth, the Indian workers, are terrified of the plague. They won't come to the factory. And there's this fear that the entire Sassoon fortune and companies will collapse. So what Flora does is she basically flies over doctors from Europe to come to India, where they come up with a vaccine. And then, again, in kind of a remarkable moment, she decides to take the first injection of the vaccine because the Indian workers are terrified of it. They don't know what this is all about. And she has a picture taken of her with her bare arm getting the injection, and then circulates that among her workers. And it works. They decide to take the vaccine, they return to work, and the Sassoon business is stabilized. At that point, the brothers-in-law in London begin to realize this may not work out just as we thought. Flora is clearly very smart, very strong-willed, and they essentially stage a boardroom coup that rearranges the stock and control and basically drive her out of the company. She goes on to move to London, where she becomes a very well-known philanthropist and Jewish scholar, but she never sets foot in the Sassoon business offices again. As a friend of mine in China said to me, she hit the bamboo ceiling. The other woman who's really quite remarkable is a woman named Laura Kadoorie. So the Kadoories were another family, the other family that I write about. They were distant and poor relatives of the Sassoons. And they were in Baghdad. And one of the challenges the Sassoons had faced, that David Sassoon, the patriarch, had faced, as they grew their empire across China, was how do we staff it? Who do we send there? It's very often would take weeks to have communications go back and forth between offices, between the headquarters in Bombay and the offices in China. How could they trust people? And so they sent word back to Baghdad, to the Jewish communities in Baghdad, and said, if you will send your sons, they were almost always sons, to work for us, we will educate them, we'll apprentice them and train them. We will build Jewish hospitals so they can get medical care, Jewish synagogues so they can pray, Jewish cemeteries so they can have a Jewish burial. It's sort of the idea of a company town almost, but spread all across India and China. And so many of these families in Baghdad send their Jewish, often teenage boys, to work for the Sassoons. And so the Kadoorie family has fallen on hard times, and their mother decides to send 4 of her sons to work for the Sassoons, the youngest being Ellie Kadoorie, who leaves home at 15. And I just imagine what it must be like to be 15 years old, to leave the only life you've ever known, and go to India, China, knowing that you will never see your family again. Ellie Kadoorie comes to India. The Sassoons train him. After 2 or 3 years, he's sent to China, to a small outpost north of Shanghai, and begins working for them. But he realizes pretty quickly there's a lot of money to be made in China. It's almost like the Silicon Valley of its day. There's just incredible opportunity there. So he leaves the Sassoons, goes to Hong Kong, and very quickly becomes a millionaire, trading, investing in hotels. And when he's 30, he decides it's time to get a wife. And so he sails to London and meets Laura, who is the daughter of a very wealthy Jewish family, part of what was called the British Jewish aristocracy. And they get married, and typically what would have happened was that she would get pregnant, and then Ellie would return to China, do his business, come home maybe once or twice a year to see his family. But Laura is a very spirited woman and very adventurous, and she basically announces she's not staying in London, she's going with Ellie back to China. And so they sail back to China. They quickly have two boys in Hong Kong. And then Laura announces that when Ellie is going on his business trips and forays into China, this has been the early 1900s, she's going to accompany him. And even more remarkably and wonderful for my purposes, she keeps a diary. She keeps a diary of all her travels, which reads like, Katharine Hepburn and the African Queen. I mean, it's, while Ellie is off doing his business deals, she's in rickshaws, going through muddy streets. She's on ships while various Western powers are attacking them and invading China, carving it up. And she, in many ways, I think, becomes the conscience of the Kadoorie family, because one of the things she concludes amidst all this chaos and poverty that she's seeing in China is that the problem with China, she says, is that girls are not being educated. Now remember, this is in the early 1900s. This is not kind of a World Bank study, 100 years later. And she persuades her husband to fund schools for Chinese girls. Their really only chance at an education. And part of what's remarkable as I kind of talk about this book around the country and elsewhere is that a few times there's been a very kind of aged woman sitting in the front row, in her 90s, and she will say, I was in a Kadoorie school. I went to one of those schools. It was the only opportunity I would have ever had for an education. So after this kind of period of traveling around China, Laura insists that they have to settle down. The boys are getting older, and they buy a mansion in Shanghai. A few years after they settle down there, a fire breaks out in the mansion. Laura runs out, her boys get out, but Laura is convinced that the governess, the Chinese servant she had hired to take care of her boys, is still inside the burning building. And so she runs back in. And she gets lost in the smoke. She's overcome. She collapses and she dies. And as it turned out, the governess had gotten out through another door. And this is obviously a tragedy for the Kadoorie family. It marks them permanently. But it's also a story that the Chinese talk about and tell each other over and over again. This idea that a rich Western woman would go into a burning building to save a Chinese servant is kind of unimaginable at a time when China is kind of being occupied by all these Western powers, and there's so much poverty and so much death that Laura Kadoorie would do this is something that the Chinese still talk about. And so I want to jump ahead a little bit to the 1920s and 1930s. Because if a movie is ever made of this book, the star of it will be Victor Sassoon. Victor Sassoon was one of the Sassoons who had come from part of the family that had settled in London. And he was a very wealthy playboy. Even as a college student, he was known for walking around with a chorus girl on each arm. He had a fantastic wine cellar. He was the most eligible bachelor in Europe, immensely wealthy. And during World War I, his plane that he's piloting crashes, and he becomes disabled. He loses the use of his legs. And he falls into a depression and basically concludes that he'll never be able to have the kind of playboy life he was hoping for now that he's walking around on canes or in a wheelchair. So he decides to go to India and China to see if he can make a go of it there, leave Europe behind it. Well, as it turns out, Victor is a brilliant businessman. He moves all the Sassoon money to Shanghai and builds the hotel that I was kind of trying to find the bathroom in, a number of other buildings, and he has a great time. The Financial Times wrote a great review of my book, and they had a line there that I wish I had used in the book, where they said, while it was probably more profitable to be a Kadoorie, it was much more fun to be a Sassoon. Victor Sassoon basically turned Shanghai in the 1920s into sort of a stop on the Grand Tour. Charlie Chaplin goes to visit him because he's heard about these parties that Victor Sassoon gives. He dresses up as a circus master, and everyone has to dress up as a circus act. He dresses up as a schoolmaster, and everyone has to dress up as school children. Noel Coward comes to Shanghai and writes private lives in a suite at Victor Sassoon's hotel. Wallis Simpson, who will make the King of England leave his throne, has her picture taken in Shanghai, only wearing a life jacket. So that kind of gives you a sense of what Shanghai was like. And Victor Sassoon is living an extraordinary, rich life there. When I was doing the research for the book, I went to the Cathay Hotel where he had built a penthouse kind of overlooking his empire in Shanghai. He's the richest man in Shanghai, so he builds this lavish penthouse. And I went in, I'm looking around and poked into the bathroom, and there were 2 bathtubs there. And so I turned to one of the Chinese fellows who was taking me around, and I said, why are there 2 bathtubs? And he blushes and he says, Victor Sassoon always said he didn't mind sharing his bed, but he didn't like sharing his bath. So that gives you a sense of what it was like to be Victor Sassoon. Now, at a certain point in the late 1930s, these cruise ships that are coming with Charlie Chaplin and Noel Coward and celebrities and others start bringing a different group of people. And these are Jews who are fleeing Europe as the Nazis advance. In 1936, 1937, as we all know, the Nazis have taken over, they've invaded Austria, it's clear that war is going to break out across Europe, and the Jews are in a panic. But we also know that at the same time, every single country in the world is refusing to admit Jewish refugees, including the United States, including Great Britain, everywhere, except Shanghai. Because Shanghai had been carved up by all these colonizing powers, the Americans controlled part, the British controlled part, the Germans were there, the Japanese were surrounding it, the French controlled part. There was essentially no functioning government in Shanghai. And what that meant was if you were able to make it to Shanghai as a Jewish refugee, you were safe. They could not turn you away. They just didn't have the capability to do it. And so every month, thousands of Jewish refugees are showing up in this place called Shanghai they've maybe heard about, don't know much about, but believe this is the one chance they might have to escape the fate that they fear awaits them. And when you see the moving pictures or the photographs, I mean, these ships are showing up with these refugees, most of whom were middle class or upper middle class. They were lawyers and doctors, musicians, merchants, all dressed in their kind of Sunday best as if they're going for a walk on the Kudamm or in Vienna, and they're looking down at the chaos of Shanghai with packed streets. No one speaks English, no one speaks German. There's no way to communicate. And they have, the Jewish refugees have no money. It was all confiscated by the Nazis as they were trying to leave. And at this point, Victor Sassoon and the Kadoories really step forward and try to deal with this crisis. Victor Sassoon turns over a number of his buildings to become dormitories. He employs many of these Jews. The Kadoories actually start a school in Shanghai with instruction in English. They hire a number of these refugees to be teachers and to give the kids some structure, because they're kind of wandering around Shanghai as their parents are trying to figure out how they're going to survive in this new place. And that's one of the reasons why I know we have some people here and others who grow up in Shanghai. So Michael Blumenthal, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Lawrence Tribe, the Harvard professor, Peter Max, you might remember, who did posters back in the 60s, all of them grew up in Shanghai as the sons and daughters of these Jewish refugees. Now, having all these Jewish refugees is making the Japanese very nervous. The Japanese, have already invaded China. And they've essentially come right up to the boundary of Shanghai. And they haven't conquered it because it's before Pearl Harbor, and they don't want to get the U.S. into the war. They don't want to give the U.S. an opportunity to come in. So they're basically lurking and waiting all around Shanghai. And they have appointed a Japanese Colonel Inuzuka, to deal with this Jewish problem. Japan is allied with Germany, and the Nazis are saying to the Japanese, like, what are you going to do about this? You've now got 15,000 Jewish refugees. What are you going to do? And so the Captain Inuzuka comes in, and he meets with Victor Sassoon. And it turns out that the Japanese, while they're anti-Semitic, actually believe that while the Jews control the world and they control the economy, if we get on their good side, they can help us. There are kind of historical reasons for that, but it's kind of the mindset they have. And Victor Sassoon basically does nothing to disabuse them of that notion. He says to them, your officers are welcome to visit my nightclub, stay at my hotel. Maybe I'll invest in some of your companies. I'll talk to Churchill, my friend, and make sure he stays out of the war. I'll contact my Hollywood friends, and they'll speak to Robert Morgenthau and Roosevelt and kind of use their influence. At the same time, he's having his waiters and bartenders spy on the Japanese, report on what they're doing. He himself is actually flying to South America, where he's trying to buy land where these Jewish refugees might settle. Ultimately, the Japanese realize what he's doing. And when they're about to arrest him, he flees and he makes it to India before Pearl Harbor. The Kadoories are not so lucky. They remain in Shanghai. They go to Hong Kong, believing it's safer. But when Pearl Harbor happens, the Japanese move very swiftly, and they arrest all the Kadoories, Ellie Kadoorie and Lawrence and Horace, the two children who are now in their 30s, and put them under arrest in Japanese prisoner camps. Now, at this point, the Japanese control Shanghai, and the Nazis send over several members of the Gestapo who have been overseeing the liquidation of ghettos in Poland. And they meet with the Japanese, and they say to them, okay, you've got this Jewish problem, here's how you solve it. On Rosh Hashanah, all these Jews will be going to these synagogues, the synagogues that the Sassoons had built, many years before, but are now, being used by the refugees. And they say you can arrest all the men there, then you pick up the women and children from their homes. You take them all to the river, and you put them on barges, and you sink the barges, and that will solve your Jewish problem. Now, the Japanese are horrified by this, in part because they believe that maybe these Jews are still useful as hostages, that because they believe Jews are so influential, if they keep them, maybe America or Europe will somehow negotiate an early end to the war or something like that. In fact, the Japanese and Colonel Inuzuka, who's trying to broker this, calls it the fugu plan, where fugu is a Japanese fish, and if you slice it, you have to be very careful because it's poisonous. And if you puncture the sac of poison, then you'll die from eating it. But if you do it and avoid that, then it's delicious. And Inuzuka kind of writes to his superiors in Tokyo and says, this is what the Jews are like. If we do it the right way, maybe they can benefit us. As a result, 15,000 Jews, 17,000 Jews seek haven in Shanghai. Victor Sassoon has succeeded in keeping the gates open. And even though he's fled, of the 17,000 Jews who are in Shanghai, none of them are killed during the war. They are put in what's called a ghetto, which the Japanese do, which is very crowded. There are 17,000 Jews. There are 100,000 Chinese who are kind of crammed into this neighborhood. And housing is bad, and there's not enough food, but there's a way in which normal life continues. There are people being ordained as rabbis. There are different newspapers in German that are being published. There are 2 orchestras, which of course, because they're Jews, are feuding with each other. And when the Americans liberate Shanghai, they're told they're going to liberate the Shanghai ghetto. And many of the soldiers have already been liberating the concentration camps in Europe, and so they brace themselves for what they're about to see. But instead, what they discover is kind of this, yes, poor and very very bedraggled Jewish community, but everyone is still alive. In some ways, it's one of the great miracles of World War II. So the war ends, and the Kadoories and Victor Sassoon return to Shanghai, figuring the parties will start again, business will start again, and they'll once again be able to make the huge profits they've been making. But as we know, it doesn't turn out that way. Within a couple of years, the communists have conquered Shanghai. Victor Sassoon flees, and even though he buys a return ticket, he never goes back. He ends up settling in the Bahamas. He's lost almost everything, and he becomes quite bitter. At one point, he says, "I didn't leave China, China left me," kind of like a scorned lover. The Kadoories, instead of going away from China, go to Hong Kong. And they begin to rebuild their fortune there. And they become the driving force, turning Hong Kong from this kind of isolated outpost into the kind of economic miracle that we've seen. They end up owning and building the electrical system, hotels, the Peninsula Hotel, which is now a global chain. They're investing everywhere and become the richest Western family in Hong Kong. Today, in fact, the Kadoories are worth more than $13 billion. They're still based in Hong Kong. And during that entire time in Hong Kong, they never say a bad word about China, because they're convinced that at some point China will open up again and will need Western support and Western investment. And in 1978, when China opens up, one of the first phone calls is to the Kadoories, inviting them back. And the Kadoories today they own the largest nuclear plant in China, they own hotels, they're very important investors. However, they're based in Hong Kong, and I was just in Hong Kong a few weeks ago, and they're very nervous because, once again, Chinese politics is swerving off in different directions. Things are becoming much more nationalistic. And at one level, they're worried, is this going to be Shanghai all over again? I'll stop there because I'm sure you have some questions. But one of the thoughts I want to leave you with is that what was fascinating to me about these families is that, Jewish history is often about, great scholars, or it's about the Holocaust. In this case, I found both families, they could be here with us today, right? They could be attending our synagogues. And they faced a series of moral choices throughout their lives. And they don't know how history ends, right? They don't know that the Japanese will invade. They don't know that the Holocaust will happen. They don't know that the communists will take over. And so throughout their lives, they're facing these choices. Do we sell opium or not? Do we, understand what the communists are doing or not? And it just made me think about the times we live in and how at some point, 50 or 100 years from now, historians will look back and wonder about the choices we made in our business lives, our personal lives, and how we'll measure up to what we really should expect from ourselves. So I'll stop there and welcome any questions. Thank you. Jenna, do you want to spot people?
Yes, so just raise your hand if you have a question. We'll come find you with the microphone. There's one on that side of the room also.
Hi, I just wanted to Thank you for your presentation, but I also wanted to ask you two questions that maybe you can elaborate on. One is if you could discuss the connection between, I believe it was the Kadoorie family Ellie, right? Ellie Kadoorie?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he was a editor of a paper in Shanghai, and I think he was very pro-Zionist prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. If you could discuss
Sure.
the relationship that he had. And second, if you could also connect the dots between these two families and another Jewish important figure in China, Morris Cohen.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Good questions. So the Zionism question is quite interesting and really very important. The exhibit, I think, does a very good job describing this. The Sassoons are all in on imperialism, colonialism, and the British. I mean, David Sassoon, as I say, becomes a British citizen. He never speaks a word of English, but makes sure his children do speak English. And so they are very committed to Great Britain. The Kadoories keep on trying to get British citizenship, and they keep on being turned down. I actually found a document from the 1920s in Hong Kong where the British Consul General or whatever in Hong Kong is writing, if we give Ellie Kadoorie citizenship, we'll have to do it for all of them. And so it was clear that they were kind of trying to keep them. And frankly, Laura becomes very influential in this because Laura, who has grown up in Britain, says to Ellie, you have to start giving money, forget the synagogues and the schools for girls, you have to give money to the British royal family's favorite charities. And then they will not only give you citizenship, but give him a knighthood, which he gets. But as a result of that, Ellie, who I think always feels like an outsider, becomes a very fervid Zionist. And one of the things he does, which I think becomes very important for China, is that when the Balfour Declaration is issued, one of the things that's going on is the effort to get every country in the world to endorse it. And so Ellie takes it upon himself to write to Sun Yat-sen, who's sort of the George Washington of China. And he writes to him and meets with him and says, will you endorse the Balfour Declaration and ultimately the creation of the State of Israel? And Sun Yat-sen writes to him this extraordinary letter where he says, both of our people have been dispossessed. You have been driven out of your homeland. Our homeland is being occupied by foreign powers. And I hope that one day both our people will be able to reclaim control and live in peace in their homelands, which again for Chinese history is really important, and I think the Chinese have always kind of clung to that. So in that sense, he is very much a Zionist, but he could be very obstreperous, and so at one point he is giving money to Palestine. And he meets with Chaim Weizmann and basically proposes, he calls it the Jewish Garden City, but he wants his two sons to become in charge of it. And Chaim Weizmann says no, and Ellie pulls back the donation. It says, you're nicer to the Rothschilds than you are to me, and he kind of goes back to China. So he could be a tough negotiator. But Zionism is very important to the Kadoories. Morris Cohen, for some of you who may not know, is when Chiang Kai-shek is in the U.S. and elsewhere, he hires Morris Cohen to be kind of his bodyguard and to fight with him. And one of the things that's so interesting is that, in 175 years with these families all across China, deeply enmeshed in the politics and in the economics of China, no one ever bothered to learn Chinese. And one of the impacts of that is that while they're incredibly astute businessmen, politically they keep on making one wrong move after another, including not seeing that the communists are going to take over and so forth. And so Morris Cohen is part of Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalists in the 1930s. And the nationalists are basically wooing Victor Sassoon. And Victor Sassoon is investing in all sorts of nationalist enterprises, including the banks. And when I look through his business diaries, there are all these meetings with top nationalist officials. And then Out of the blue, one morning, the Chinese nationalists nationalize all the banks, essentially freezing all of Victor Sassoon's money. He can't take it out. And he's kind of outraged and, how could they do this to me? And it's sort of an example, I think, which is something I think has long been true of China, that the Western fascination with China and our belief that, oh, they're just like us, this goes back a long way. And I'm not saying Morris Cohen was kind of part of it, but it fed this myth somehow that the nationalists, look, they have this Jewish guy who's kind of, running security for them. And in the end, it was the Chinese who were always in charge.
I'm not the little old lady sitting in the front who lived in Shanghai, but I was born in Baghdad. My father worked for the Kadoories in Shanghai, actually principally in Mumbai, but also traveled to Shanghai on their behalf in the very, very early 1920s. And my mother was actually educated at a Laura Kadoorie school in Baghdad. So I do have a relationship to that. And in fact—
Did I get it right?
You got it very right. And also, when we lived in India following the Farhud during the Second World War, we also met with the Kadoories, and they were in our home in London when we finished up in London. But I do have a question after all that. I know that one of Ellie's sons, and I think it was Horace, who got into agriculture in a big way in Hong Kong. And I'm not clear on exactly what he did, but he became an agronomist. And could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's an even better story than that. So Ellie Kadoorie has two sons, Lawrence and Horace. And, my agent, Michael Carlisle, is here. And when we were selling the book, you meet with publishers and editors, and you kind of talk about the book, and people kept on asking us, is this a Jewish book? Is it a China book? And we'd say, no, it's a family book. It's about these families. And so in the Kadoorie family, when Laura dies in that fire, they move back to London, try to put their lives back together. But Ellie's business is having trouble in China, so he insists that he goes back and that the boys come with him. And Horace is actually studying agronomy. He wants to become a gentleman farmer. He's yanked out of that. Lawrence is in law school. He's yanked out of that, and essentially have to kind of work for their dad. And Horace never really likes the business stuff. One of the great things about the Kadoorie family is that they had this incredible archive, which included letters back and forth that the two brothers would write to each other. Lawrence was in Hong Kong. Lawrence was in Hong Kong. Horace was in Shanghai. And it's almost like reading Facebook messages. They're writing literally every day back and forth about what's going on, really with the most tender kind of sign-offs at the end. But Lawrence, being the elder brother, is haranguing Horace all the time, saying, you've got to take business more seriously. When the refugees start arriving, Horace throws himself into saving them. He builds this school. And then after the communists take over and he has to leave, he settles in Hong Kong. And he's living in a mansion that the Kadoories had in Hong Kong in a more rural part. At this point, hundreds of thousands of Chinese are fleeing China. They're fleeing communism because they're terrified of what the communists are going to do to farmers and small merchants and so forth. And Horace goes into his garden one day, and he notices this strange guy he's never met before working on the gardening. And he says to his maid, in the kind of broken Chinese that he knows, what's this guy doing here? And the maid says, he's a refugee. He's fleeing. He's my cousin. He's fleeing the Chinese, and I wanted to protect him. And Horace looks at him and says, I understand. I'm a refugee too. I had to flee Shanghai. And the Kadoories, Horace and Lawrence, their father has died in Japanese captivity. They're now taking over everything. And they basically conclude that their father made a mistake. That huge mansion I described, the Chinese, where the Chinese took their kids for their music lessons, was a 44-room mansion with 42 servants and 3 people living in it. Ellie Kadoorie and his 2 boys. And while they were living there, Chinese were literally dying in the street. There was terrible poverty. And as they look at what happened to the family and the family fortune, the boys decide that their father was blind to what was going on, and they could not afford to make the same mistake. And so Horace Kadoorie, because of this interest he has in farming, starts an organization. And again, this is in like 1948, 1950, that basically gives microloans to these Chinese farmers who are fleeing communism, enough money to buy, some spades, some shovels, do some basic irrigation, and to allow them to grow crops they can then sell to make money to support themselves in Hong Kong. But Horace then also funds research into animals that they can raise, chickens and so forth, but especially pigs, because as we know, pork is a staple of the Chinese diet. And so they actually create, with Horace's funding, a new kind of pig that's bigger and fatter, and you can sell it for more money, and it can help feed the growing population of Hong Kong. And in fact, to this day, if you go to these rural parts of Hong Kong, you'll see signs of these kind of microloan programs. But if you talk to the Chinese and mention the Kadoories, they'll say, oh, the Kadoories, they know everything about pig except what it tastes like. So he really was very important, and I think that in the end, his efforts ended up helping about 300,000 Chinese refugees in Hong Kong. And I think that was one of the lessons he took from having helped these Jewish refugees to figure out how he could help the Chinese refugees.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I grew up in Shanghai as a teenager, and Horace Kadoorie gave us our school where I went to. It was officially called the Shanghai Jewish Youth Association, but lovingly called the Kadoorie School. And I was in the ghetto there, and both the Sassoons and Kadoories helped us a lot, obviously. And I was lucky enough, many years later, we had a reunion, a Shanghai reunion in California, and Horace Kadoorie came
Right.
came to the reunion, and I met him.
Oh.
That was a very big deal.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because the Kadoories did, and Horace Kadoorie did get this kind of opportunity to see, and there's a moving scene, I think, at the reunion you're talking about, where it's held in a synagogue, and the rabbi of the synagogue had fled Berlin after Kristallnacht, and had carried the Torah that they had saved from the synagogue in Berlin when it was destroyed, and had carried it with him to Shanghai, had kept it in Shanghai, and then when he went to San Francisco, brought it with him, and they were able to put it in the synagogue. But there's an extraordinary moment where someone stands up and says, all of you who were saved by Horace Kadoorie and the school, please stand up, and all these people stand up. And then they say, all of you who are children of people who were saved, and they stand up. And then all of you who are grandchildren, and then you see people standing up with their babies. I mean, it's really extraordinary. The other side of it, which I find kind of poignant, Victor Sassoon, and I think the exhibit reflects this about the Sassoons. I met some of his relatives. He ended up, as I say, he was a playboy. He didn't get married till he was 65. He married his nurse in the Bahamas. And I met members of that part of the family. And Victor Sassoon never talked about what he did to help the Jews. And I think part of it was he understood how Britain operated. He was hobnobbing with the Queen Mother. He was involved in all sorts of very high-level things with the aristocracy. And he was, I think, sadly, never appreciated for what he did. He always kept it quiet. And I think that reflected his ambivalence about identifying as being Jewish, being seen as different than the British aristocracy that he was that he was trying to become part of. One story I will tell briefly about research. People always say, what was the research like? So as I say, Victor Sassoon married his nurse, who was from Dallas, Texas. So as a result, when he died, his papers went to Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. And so I went down there to look through them, all these business diaries and things. And so I'm taking out his business diaries, and they have all the lists of, I had dinner with this mega millionaire and this one, and I'm investing or I'm not. And then suddenly pictures of naked women start slipping out of the, and I'm terrified the very nice Southern librarian is going to come over and say, like, what in God's name are you doing? It turned out that one of the ways Victor Sassoon met women was he would go down to meet these cruise ships that were bringing celebrities and wealthy families to Shanghai, and he was an amateur photographer, and he would go up to these beautiful women and say, will you let me take your picture? Come back to my studio. And he did, but the fact that he kept them in his business diary, I thought was kind of interesting. But one of the other things was that the women, there were Asian women as well as Western women. And in a way, what you could see was that while he was very wealthy and imperialist and all that, on some of the social aspects of what was going on in Shanghai, he was opening up his hotel to wealthy Chinese. He was clearly taking pictures of their daughters. But I think it kind of gave an interesting view into what Victor Sassoon's life was like, which was a lot more exciting than I would have anticipated.
I think we had one final question right here.
So I have a few questions. I guess, when did David Sassoon, when was he alive? I was in India and saw the David Sassoon Library, and there's a statue of him, and I thought they came in the 1600s, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, it wasn't until the 1820s.
1820s. Okay, and then what about all the other Sassoon brothers? Like, where did they go? Did they all stay in London? Or did
Right.
Did they go to Syria? Did they go to Lebanon?
Right.
Did they go to Israel?
No, one of the things when you write a book like this, which is supposed to be popular and accessible, when I sent the manuscript in, my editor called me up and said, we don't have to know about all 8 brothers. And so essentially, in terms of the statues, the Sassoons were very clever, I think, in understanding how British imperialism worked. And so what you see very quickly is David Sassoon's eldest son, Abdullah Sassoon, renames himself Albert Sassoon. He starts wearing Western clothing. David, the father, is always seen in Baghdadi clothing. The others very quickly are wearing waistcoats and so forth. And then whenever a British royal visits India in the 19th century, the Sassoons are right there. We're going to build a statue for you. And you kind of see a lot of those. So again, from a family point of view, David Sassoon, the patriarch, had these 8 sons. And one way he kept control of them was that he never allowed any of them to become partners, right? He retained all the control and kind of directed things. In the end, 1 or 2 became partners, but as might be predicted, once he died, the family kind of flew apart. There was a lot of jealousy and anger and so forth. They split into 2 factions, and there's a lot of kind of bad feeling because of that. They end up doing extremely well in Great Britain. They become art collectors and politicians and so forth. A few fall on hard times. And in fact, what's interesting is that there's now word increasingly of the Sassoons selling off some of their artwork because those are the relatives who are not necessarily, doing incredibly well. But the family has this extraordinary legacy, and certainly in Great Britain, they're kind of an object of real fascination. And the one thing, again, when you're talking about a book like this, in Hong Kong, I was interviewed as part of this festival at one point by a British journalist, a pretty well-known British journalist named Ben Judah. And literally, before we go on stage, he said to me, I'm part of the Sassoon family. And I was like, oh my God, this is going to be. But he said there were a lot of things in there that I didn't know. And of course, the history we hear at the kitchen table is often very different than the family history that exists. So I have heard from members of the family who basically say, we didn't know this, and they find it fascinating.
Hi, I don't have a question. First, I want to say thank you very much. Beautiful presentation. As I told you before, I was born in Shanghai after the war, 47. Just to share with you, when my family arrived in Shanghai in 1939, before they found a place to live, they were put up in what they call these heims, sponsored by the Sassoon family. So we're always very thankful for that. And my father's cousin's daughter, who's 94 now, alive and well, living in California, cousin B went to the Kadoorie school. We speak to each other frequently, and every now and then I pick her brain, and she shares with me a little bit of history, something that I can still
Sure.
enjoy,
Right,
and which
right.
I share with other people.
That's
also.
great.
Thank you.
So, I mean, maybe just one note I'll end on, which is sort of that personal note. One of the things that's so interesting about Chinese-Jewish relations, China is one of the few places you can go in this world when you say you're Jewish and you don't get a lecture about Israel or Zionism or something. The Chinese have this real fascination with Jews, and I think an affection which is kind of interesting, but it's born out of the experience of the refugees. When the refugees talk about what it was like in Shanghai for them, most of them, remember, had fled Berlin, Vienna. I mean, their neighbors had turned on them. They were being humiliated. They were literally being chased out of their homes. They arrive in Shanghai. Chinese are desperately poor, but what they talk about over and over again is how nice the Chinese were to them. They would give their kids rides in rickshaws. They would teach them how to cook on these very simple stoves that they had. There's a PBS documentary called Harbor from the Holocaust, which actually looks at this from the Chinese point of view. And there was a way in which the Chinese and the Jewish refugees, even though they couldn't really talk to each other, recognized kind of a common language of suffering and perseverance. And I think that even today, if you go to Shanghai, there's a terrific museum of the refugees. They've preserved a lot of the buildings. I think it's something China's really proud of, and that they've only kind of rediscovered in recent years, that there was a human connection that was built then, which is really something wonderful to see. So,
Thank you again, Jonathan Kaufman. If you'd like to get a book purchased, you can do that at the table near the door and line up in front of the stage to get your book signed. Thank you.